Good morning, everybody. Welcome to MASTERCLASS. We've had some technical difficulties with this, but we're going to go ahead with it and see if we can get it through. That sometimes I have to empty my camera from all of its amazing cat videos. That I had to delete several cat videos to get this video to work, and that we're all in one shot is okay because we're professors, and I'm Dr. Sheley, and I'm teaching this class at Harvard, USC, and CALARTS, and that Harvard doesn't have a film school isn't totally true. That their comparative lit degree is a secret degree for film school, but a lot of people just think that it's comparative literature, but it's actually a film degree in a weird way. So they don't have to have a film degree necessarily to be a film school, but that the theater they're building doesn't always access the prints that are found in New York and Hollywood of these old films are on these stocks that are like changing over the years, and some of them are dying. Some of these films are dying and corrupting and folding into themselves from the old film medium. That digital sustains itself a lot longer, but still has flaws in its infrastructure where you get some kind of other choppy things from a computer. The film in the film stock from available is really hard to find for films that are out of print, and that like a lot of films are out of print and not even available on DVD is kind of one of the hindrances of watching films at home and watching films by yourself. That film school doesn't always show the esoteric films, is like what we're doing today with Wizard of Oz. Now that Wizard of Oz is a color film, it does make us question when color first began. That I know in 1895 there was a film called Son of Man in Palestine that had color images, and the color images were of Jesus's life. And I don't know, Jesus was big in Palestine in 1895, and they had these images where the monks or the nuns at a convent would hand paint the color film, and it was about 1896 that it came out, but 1895. Now, cinema was invented in December 12th, 1895, so this is an early film with color that they didn't do much hand coloring. But then later, when Fouillard did Le Vampire, it's weird because he'd have these scenes, as I've said, where he'd switch on a light and the color would change for the whole stock. And if the color would change for the whole stock, we have these films that are now adapting to the colors of film and how they can, that they'd come up with a 3-strip process, red, yellow, and cyan, and that they'd mix them together and print them out. It's kind of the same way those old school printers used to work, by squirting different colors onto the page or whatever and making it the color you want out of the different bottles. And I always had to refill my cyan one, and they never had it at the store. No, at Office Depot, I'm like, I need a cyan printer. No, I'm kidding. But anyway, there's other films that I do know that Mark Twain came out before Wizard of Oz, and it was in color. There's other examples of color films. Drums Along the Mohawk is a little tricky because I don't know if it came out in 1938 or 1940. I've seen different filmographies list some of John Ford's films as different years. And John Ford's an interesting character because while he made some of the best films ever made, we'll find that his life is very complicated. But we're talking about Wizard of Oz today because we haven't really discussed Wizard of Oz. Now, epistemologically and phenomenologically, which is like the philosophy of knowledge and the philosophy of experience respectively, is that we go into the Wizard of Oz thinking, this is going to be interesting. It's a fantasy film for kids. Judy Garland was in all these kids' movies with Mickey Rooney. Yeah, Margaret Hamilton was an actress that was in several movies. And now we've got the introduction of film in the biggest way ever. That film color is going to come into the scene. This is like the jazz singer was for sound as Wizard of Oz was for color, because what happens is the process gets so good at MGM and all the other studios. Now remember, we've got MGM, Warner Brothers, Fox, RKO, and Paramount as the big five. And I didn't list them in order because it's like MGM is first, Paramount second, and they all have these big company names. Now, RKO doesn't really exist anymore, but that Disney started at RKO and became a company of itself, and all these other companies came from these big companies, and there's more to it. Universal was one of the little three with Columbia and United Artists, and United Artists was Griffith, Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks, and that they had a house called Pickfair. They started United Artists. It's a really interesting independent but for director studio, and that they celebrate the films of the independents in the little three doesn't mean they're necessarily so little, because all these companies would turn big. That Disney went adjunct from RKO and started its own company is because they had enough animators at that time to make cartoon features eventually that would come out. And 1939 is when Wizard of Oz came out, and that's a big year for cinema because Hollywood classical cinema, it's this whole sort of suture Tudor code of like everything's tied together, everything's pushed into the movie. The art is to erase the art. You see through the image, it's transparent. The proscenium doesn't even bother you. It's like looking in a mirror and seeing things the way you would want to see them. That Hollywood processes desire and the ultimate goal to desire, that Carl Jung discusses philosophically and phenomenologically, that we see things that we experience and then adapt it to our perception, and then we adapt it to our perception, and then we replay what we've seen in our own memory. And if it relates to us as the same thing we're seeing in the next few edges of the film, then we process it as an object of, do we want that to happen, or do we want that to be the way it is, or do we like that fantasy world like in Wizard of Oz? And does this fantasy world kind of have a mythology that we can learn about threshold guardians from, and how to defeat like these problems that are coming up in our lives that really aren't? But sometimes in movies I'll get really, show within the show, like I'll be in a bad mood and I'll be like ready to take it out on the film, and then the film will chill me out. But sometimes I'll be in such a bad mood that like the film wasn't very good to me. That's never happened with Wizard of Oz, of course. But I've gone to a film before and been totally in a bad mood, and I'm like, well, that's a terrible movie. And then I saw it later and I'm like, I'm in a good mood. It's actually a good movie. And that can actually be what Carl Jung's talking about. It's like, we're looking for the desire. That we desire reality is only one thing, but the reality is that we look for desire. And if we look for desire, well, what better place to look for desire than Wizard of Oz? Because Wizard of Oz is the ultimate follow the yellow brick road. Now, the yellow brick road is gold, money. Basically, it's about finding money and getting money. That gold is the color of money, because gold is money, and most people forget that gold is money, but gold is actually money. So the movie cost a lot to make, but they're making this sort of desire. This gold is luring her on. Money as desire is a classical theme that is even in It's a Wonderful Life, but that they have scruples about it. But the point is that in Wizard of Oz, we're going to take a look at the film. That in the first section is black and white, and that Dorothy, played by Judy Garland, was cast for the role, and that she sings these beautiful songs like Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Everybody knows that song, and there's all those great versions of it. There's great versions on YouTube of Somewhere Over the Rainbow. And you can get that song anytime, and I think it's a classic song, and that's weird because it's a 1930s Hollywood classical musical, and that they didn't know what they had on their hands isn't necessarily true, because Hollywood classical cinema was planning it for a long time. Even before the invention of cinema, Hollywood classical cinema was planning on doing these things. They weren't called that then. They were like chief producers and chief engineers of a medium that was coming soon, in the late 1800s, as the frontier in America was closing and Buffalo Bill's Wild Show was on vaudeville that would someday become westerns. And that Wizard of Oz was a silent era film originally, Patchwork Girl of Oz being one of the many short films that were on in the early silent era. Now that we've gotten that across, I'd like to say that Wizard of Oz is an interesting film because Salman Rushdie, with his critical reception, wrote a book on Wizard of Oz called, it's a BFI Classic Series on Wizard of Oz. And that we love seeing Judy Garland in this movie because what happens is a tornado hits Kansas, as we all know, and they kind of filmed the tornado with like tube sock off in the background, and they filmed it but that they can film special effects like that tricks even film buffs, because film buffs will be watching it going, wow, that looks like CGI, but that they'd been planning these sort of cagey, rangy film effects with different layers has a lot to do with how they filmed for depth and depth focus, even in Hollywood classical cinema. Sometimes you don't always get depth focus, like when it's a shot of a woman, it's subject-object positioning. The object of the woman can be shot in soft focus just to encourage her beauty or to objectify her, in other words. But we have an interesting picture here on the cover. This is a 2006 edition, and I remember when this one came out, and there was all these other editions, and I thought, I gotta get this one, and I'd never really owned Wizard of Oz, and it's amazing that I've been able to keep Wizard of Oz this long, even though I first got it on DVD. What I mean is I'd never really owned a copy of The Wizard of Oz when I been putting it all together and seeing that these elements were in the film, that the object of desire is the gold at the end, is the wizard. The wizard has all the gold. The gold, the Yellow Brick Road leads to Oz. That's what the good fairy says. But good fairy, where does that come from? Well, the tornado hits the cabin, and in one of the most spectacular, inspired by Frank Bond scenes ever in history of cinema that looks like The Exorcist or something, is this beautiful blowing wind that's cascading this house through the sky, and Dorothy thinks Dorothy's flying around the room, and beds are flying everywhere, and the witch comes down, and she glows in the mirror. She's going to a fantasy land through a tornado. Kind of reminds me of the Chronicles of Narnia, how they went to the fantasy land through a wardrobe, or how in Wizard of Oz, a tornado hits them is kind of similar. It's like uncanny. It's that they're in a normal everyday situation, and now they're replaced into the fantasy mythology of these threshold guardians that we have to defeat to reach our desire. Now that Hollywood is the reality of desire is because, like what Carl Jung would say, we all approach our desire with desirous intent, not exact words, but that we're coming closer to what we want because our brain and mind gear us to actually receive things that we look for, like reading a book. We look for books that are going to be our most desirous to have the outcome that we want, whether it's a piece of history we want from it, like classical Hollywood cinema. In 1939 is this big long list of Gone with the Wind and Stagecoach and Ninotchka and all these big movies that are out in 1939 that they're releasing. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington by Frank Capra. And it's this big Hollywood industry with these big studios, and MGM, Fox, Warner Brothers, Paramount, and RKO are like delivering these films that are basically what the public wants, and that the classical Hollywood cinema era doesn't really get broken up here, although there is some experimentation. And I think that that's because the film follows these suture tutors that they're invisible, they're transparent. You don't see the edits when you watch a film. That the only way you see the edit when you're watching a film is to tap the pen or make a little number when each cut comes in the film, and that helps really in handy for advanced students who are doing shot-by-shot research on the cinema, that they're putting up a shot, writing about what happens, then letting it play so they can write about the movement, and then stopping it at the next shot to write about the psychological, is post-structural structural studies of cinema, that you have to have a closed textual analysis that is only be focused on what you're reading or watching or listening to at the time. Music's a little different, but reading and watching. And now that I got all that off my chest, the thing is Dorothy's cabin from Kansas, as we all know, flies to Oz. Now, why it flies to Oz is never explained. But that she lands on this witch and smashes her is the first thing that happens. And that she just so happened to turn out to be an evil witch we're all happy about, because the good witch and all the little elves come out, and the elves come out and they're dancing around the tiny people. It's kind of a weird name, because I had a friend that was a dwarf, and he said it's kind of offensive when anybody talks about someone that's a dwarf because they don't know what it's like, but that he can handle some of the names he was called, is fine, because he knows that people have a misunderstanding or whatever about what it's like to be different. We do live in a society which everyone wants to be different, but everyone wants to be like this competitive best, and I'll admit that I've competed in a few contests and lost, and competed in a few and maybe passed by. But the point is that the competition's not always a bad thing unless it gets personal, and then this sort of rift and racism happens. Now, I'm not saying the dwarves of Wizard of Oz are frowned upon, because I think deep down everybody loves the fact that there's dwarves in Wizard of Oz. And I said elves, and you'll have to excuse me, I mean dwarves. And then Judy Garland comes upon the good witch when she meets all the dwarves, that they tell her to go on a mission to follow the Yellow Brick Road, the gold coin, the money, to the Castle of Oz, which is at the end of the road, that they have to confront these tests, allies, and enemies, like The Writer's Journey would say, by Christopher Vogler, another required reading. No, you don't have to, but that they're going on this money road and they're defeating threshold guardians as they go, can be seen later in the movie, that there's sort of this threshold guardian of poppies that fall upon her, the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, and the Cowardly Lion. That those are the characters that she picks up along the way and takes with her each one, that she's adding to her quasi-inventory, that she's taking each one of these fantasy creatures, her allies, on the road to the wizard because they don't have something they want. That all she wants is to get back to Kansas is the weird part, because the good witch, although in her power, she could have maybe sent Dorothy to Oz, or I mean back to Kansas, but she doesn't have the power to, or she wants Dorothy to go on an adventure. And that we all want to go on an adventure with Dorothy means that we don't want her to go to Kansas right away because we're in this fantasy world, but that she's in the unknown world of the fantasy, but it's her desire to get home, which is a representation of nostalgia, that she desires to get home, and that she has to confront these enemies of hers and allies along the way, is interesting, because when it finally becomes the approach to the inmost cave, which is a question of the mythic structure on Christopher Vogler, that's, by the way, based on Joseph Campbell's writings of The Power of Myth. So once she gets to the dark world of the queen, and she's got all three characters with her because she's given them each something, like the wizard will give them each something to help them out. Like she greases the Tin Man, she tells the lion to be courageous as he can, and she stuffs the scarecrow back together and puts him up. That it's religion of the scarecrow and science of technology of the Tin Man and the politics of the lion is very true, not only about the Frank Baum, but about the movie. But let's face it, classical Hollywood cinema isn't really asking us to read in too much. That's why they're giving us this kind of expressionistic story of all these characters that are bunched up in these different costumes, and there are these beautiful costumes, beautiful sets that they use backgrounds that we know are kind of fake, but they look so beautiful that we don't care that they're special effects. And we're already getting into this idea that the special effect is part of the character, and if the special effect is part of the character, then that actually becomes part of the story. So actually, there's this theory that special effects aren't a waste of time, because they're part of the story. And if they weren't part of the story, why would the director spend so much money building a special effect unless it was for the movie? And if it was for the movie, it was probably for the story if it's a narrative film. Now, this is an unpopular view among criticism, because a lot of critics are like, well, I don't like that they doll it up with special effects. And I'm like, well, if it was a fantasy film, I could understand. But if it was like a regular everyday documentary, you don't have to have like everyone's head morphing. But in a fantasy film, yeah, you don't have to have everyone's head morphing, but sometimes there's an element of the divine, and by divine I mean the desire connecting with the sublime and the bliss, is that the special effects will actually get the viewer to stare at the film and gaze at the film more even than, some things that are objectified by the film, that you're actually taking a look at the special effects. And I got no problem with special effects. Now, I think what the critics are referring to, and I don't have any specifics, but the critics are referring to the fact that all it is special effects now. You turn it on and it's just one big special effect. Well, that's pretty good, and there are people that go to see that, but that Wizard of Oz is one big special effect, like Méliès is one big special effect, that's true. But that they had these rich textual mythological structures and actors that trained in acting that aren't just relying on the CGI to make their character move is part of it. But I'm just saying they're getting tired of the repetition of the same, everybody goes to a building, they blow up the building and they go home. They blew up the building because it was evil, and they go home and all it is special effects. I love movies like that, but they're not really the serious ones we study, only because it's only one thing. It's just generation after generation. That it took laborers on a computer long ass time to build those special effects doesn't mean you should just rye out with the kind of, I don't like special effects, so they're bad, and I'm not saying that they're not overused sometimes, but then even postmodernism, we like to overuse things. We like to overuse things so much that we purposely overuse it, and I think a lot of these animators that do these comic book movies are overusing it totally intentionally to blow it out of proportion, which is what we all love about comic books, is they're all blown out of proportion. We do like realistic ones, like the old Batman detective ones, but it's still all blown out of proportion. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing at all, because expressionism is where you take like a line and make it jagged and bigger. It's not, I'm using the wrong words, but that you intensify the effect of the greatness of the shot, or intensify the greatness of the special effect. You become totally in love with special effects, and that it's an all-digital medium will continue. but with that story later. But that Wizard of Oz is coming out in the classical Hollywood cinema's biggest bonanza with movies in history is that year, 1939, had a lot of amazing films. And 1969 did too, with Midnight Cowboy and Easy Rider, Wild Bunch. That was another big year like that, where they had all these seminal works of the American classical Hollywood cinema. Now, this defines classical Hollywood cinema, that the music in it is from MGM and that they built an original score is kind of hard to say, because some of the songs they got from collections of songs they'd been filming since the sound era, that they would build these collections of songs like almost preempting That's Entertainment, where they'd get all these dancers on a stage and it's in black and white, and they'd have them mic'd, and they'd be like a Ziegfeld Follies type thing, which originated with vaudeville, like where Buffalo Bill was a show on vaudeville. Before 1895, when cinema was invented, they would have these like current Western shows and fantasy shows in vaudeville. And that they would record the music from that, like they did with the original song of Singing in the Rain before the movie came out. They would have some originals and some not. That they would build a film song library doesn't mean they didn't go out of their way to get the rights to songs that were written even earlier than the silent era. And a lot of songs are earlier than the silent era, because if you think about it, isn't there classical music in films? Yeah, there's classical music in films. So if there's classical music in films, we know some of the films' music comes from before the start of cinema's invention. Now, we're going into the Wizard of Oz and saying, well, where's she going? Well, she meets the Scarecrow, stuffs them back together, they have a song, and they go on. She meets the Tin Man, he oils her down, they almost get a fireball thrown at him later by the witch, and it hits the Scarecrow's always getting deuced by the witch and getting deuced by the flying monkeys, and that everybody's deucing the Scarecrow is funny, because the Cowardly Lion's the cowardly one, and all they tell him is to be brave, and he never can until he meets the wizard. That Dorothy kind of lives off the assumption that the wizard's going to replace all their problems, is because the Good Witch of the North, Glinda, said, well, I'm going to have you go there to go home, so if he can get you home. She doesn't really even infer it, that these characters can get back what they need. She doesn't even infer that. She kind of says she'll meet someone along the way, but it's not like this portent or totem or omen that she has to meet anybody. And where she knows that the wizard will help them from is kind of from the characters themselves, that they're on the Yellow Brick Road and didn't know all you had to do was follow the Yellow Brick Road, as the Doors would say, to get to Oz is really interesting. And then by the time she picks up the Cowardly Lion, they're almost to Oz. They run into a field of poppies, and the poppies are sort of this objective correlative that they all need sleep because they haven't slept yet, and she hasn't slept since she went to sleep and the tornado hit. That she's kind of running away from the tornado when she gets there is weird, because she's having a dream too, and it's kind of fast to realize that she gets into her bed, and then all that exorcist stuff happens, and she wakes up. And that the witches chasing them in every corner, the Wicked Witch of the West, and there's a musical called Wicked that's really beautiful, and that they did a good job with showing her story. And there's a new Oz version by Sam Raimi that's a Disney version of The Wonderful, the Powerful Oz, and that's a great movie too. And these are all great Oz movies, and they all harken back to the fact that Oz was around in the silent era, that the witch comes back and writes the word surrender Dorothy when they get to Oz, which is the Kingdom of Oz. Now, the Wizard of Oz lives in Oz, but the Kingdom of Oz is where they come to first and knock on the door like they do in Star Wars. That little guy comes out, that little camera comes out. That's kind of what they do in the Wizard of Oz. It's like the mythology matches. It's like when they approach the inmost cave, however, when they see the word surrender Dorothy, even the guy that says he's not the Wizard of Oz that turns out to be, sends them on a mission before they can meet the wizard to kill the witch. And that it's a witch killer movie is totally weird, because now we're thinking Dorothy might be a witch because the Good Witch of the North is a witch. And that Dorothy killed the old witch means that she's pretty much like some kind of witch of the South, or not the West or the East, because we pretty much are assuming that those are the evil witches. Now that the evil witch is the South and the good witch is the East, we never really find out. But we can infer that Dorothy is a witch. She killed a witch. Now she has to kill another witch. Sometimes witches have to kill witches, not just for like power or battles, But there's some things about it that we're not going to talk about that are in the occult about witches killing witches. And that's totally woven into the plot as like this sort of desirous temptation of the whole movie. And Salman Rushdie writes more about that in his BFI Classic. And I'd like you to take a look at that book if you ever can. It's a hard to track down book, but you can find it on the internet. That they go to the inmost cave, as Christopher Vogler would say, and that they go on in, and it's really scary. And of course, the scarecrow gets deuced again by the flying monkeys. The flying monkeys are amazing special effects. How they built those costumes, I'll never know. Like, I know they weren't made out of paper mache, so how did they make rubber like that into wings? This movie has a huge budget, and the special effects hold up today. That today's audiences still love this film, kids love this film today, means it's translatable to our current audience, unlike some other films that stopped being translatable within like months after they were released. And we know we have some of those in our era, but I'm not really going to give an example of that. Other than Birth of a Nation, we all know it didn't work after about 5 months after it was released, until Griffith gave Oscar Micheaux not a lesson, but he gave him money, and that Oscar Micheaux would have been pissed if Griffith didn't, but that's another story for another time. But the point is by the time Micheaux came out, Birth of a Nation was pretty much obsolete at that point. That it's not obsolete in terms of character studies and dramatical guilds and things that represent running away from New York. Now, one thing about the Birth of a Nation that's important to remember this far in class is that it was the last film that they really let the White House intervene with in Hollywood, that they built their own way of having the government out of Hollywood, was one of the reasons they had their own integral censorship program, that they didn't want the White House telling them what to do. And the White House actually doesn't tell Hollywood what to do. Can you believe that? I mean, in every other cinema in every country, usually the government tells Hollywood tells their film industry what to do. But after Birth of a Nation and Woodrow Wilson being a Klansman, and they added the Klansman footage, is really weird, because after that part was so deduced as base and immoral, which it is, that they kind of found sneaky ways to eliminate the whole Thomas Edison works for the government, and he wants the government to take over cinema, which when the government takes over cinema, we kind of get these Reefer Madness after-school specials. I'm not saying the government's bad at making movies, but they're not really trained cinematically. They're trained politically. So now we've got political leaders running the film, and they run it into the ground by putting Klansmen in it, and everybody knew that was bad. But anyway, the point is that movie became obsolete pretty much after Micheaux took over, but Wizard of Oz is never becoming obsolete, because whatever they did to make the special effects was such a mystery, and nobody knows, is even beyond some of the special effects they make today. And you're sitting there going, I don't know how they did this, but the point is it's entertaining. There's music, there's laughter, there's screams, there's rides, there's poppy plants that put you to sleep, there's witches burning through the sky. I mean, it's so epic that it's like the ultimate fairy tale, that it's the ultimate fairy tale of film. And she gets that they're in the land of merry old Oz, and horse runs by, it's changing colors 4 times. Each edit in that film changes the color of the horse in the land of merry old Oz song. When they meet the wizard and they go to Oz, and that they all get like manicures and stuff at Oz is weird, because they get like makeovers, and they look about the same afterwards, except the Cowardly Lion has some nice little braids. But anyway, that Dorothy throws water on the witch is really interesting, because why does water kill a witch? There's so many things about the occult I don't know, and if I did, I wouldn't tell you, because it's top secret. So I don't really know why water kills the witch. But that Dorothy has to kill a witch at all is kind of insinuating, well, she was a witch herself, though, is the way to say it. Because if she wasn't a witch herself, then we'd have problems and think it's like the Crucible or Salem's Lot or something, where she's killing witches just because she's killing witches. But that all the witches are trying to kill her, and she's basically a witch, and we don't know that, is like, or we do, is like one of the reasons this fantasy world is kind of complex and really interwoven into the infrastructure of American culture as well as worldwide culture, because internationally this film does just as good and explodes all over the world. And that we've seen this film more times than any other film isn't just because it's on TV all the time. It's the default, what should we watch? Let's watch Wizard of Oz again. And I know some people think it's dated, it's not even that important anymore, that it's stale, there's no reason to watch it. haven't seen it, or if they have, they might as well be a stick in the mud. I mean, a stick in the mud would say, oh, it's just boring images of some girl singing and walking on a road. I mean, that's like saying Lord of the Rings is just a bunch of guys walking around or running around, which that it is to some extent, but that's like saying The Wizard of Oz is just some girl walking around. Because does anything happen on the way in those movies? But anyway, I want to sum up this whole movie thing because there's more to talk about. We got to get to the next film, but the last thing I'll say is when Dorothy's returning to her home, which goes back to black and white because see we have black and white, and then the tornado hits, and right when she gets to Oz, this is the surprise part that foments color forever. Is she goes out into the country, and we have this into the Oz, and she's seeing it for the first time, and the camera goes in and follows it around. But now we have Technicolor. So now we have a technique that's really not used in cinema at all ever since and ever before, but anybody can, and that's a black and white movie that becomes a color movie, which they do that a little bit in Raging Bull. But it's a black and white movie that becomes a color movie that goes back to black and white at the end. Now, that Pleasantville kind of has that theme too is true, and that there are examples of films that go to black and white and into color. But The Wizard of Oz is significant because in terms of mainstream Hollywood, there hasn't been a lot of films that have gone black and white to color. The Women by George Cukor, another exception. It has a black and white and color scene. I don't know the last time when I saw a film that went from black and white to color, back to black and white. I know that Sin City has some color and it's black and white, and so does Schindler's List, and I think that's great. I'm just getting at the point that that is used a few times, I guess, but not really that often, and that it hasn't been used for a full effect like that is because then everyone's going to be like, oh, they're plagiarizing Wizard of Oz if they're using it for a fantasy film. You know, it's very rigid on what we write about and how ideas themselves can be copyrighted. It's like, well, I had the idea for that movie long before the director did, but his was totally different. Well, then you didn't have the idea for it because it was totally different. You know, I don't understand that. I don't really know about that. And I even work for the Writers Guild, and it's like, can we arbitrate over whose idea that was when actually we're looking at whose script it was? Like, I don't care if, like, Jimmy Rogers had the idea first or Lawrence Kasdan had the idea first, you know, which in that case, I'd say Lawrence Kasdan probably had the idea first. But it doesn't matter because even in the course of history, we find out people get ideas after someone else gets an idea, and it's the first time they got it, the idea ever, because it was altered a little bit from previously, and that's an epistemology that we can't really trace without a lot of hard philosophy, that going through epistemology and the knowledge that we accrue from films, that we learn about the process of desire as we study it in this class, but we learn about the process of experience from cinema itself because we experience these things on a picture and the picture is moving. Automated succession of projected images. It's automatic, it's a succession, it's projected, and they're images. That's cinema. So when she gets in the hot air balloon to go back to Oz or go back to Kansas and before it turns back to black and white, she sees this girl in the crowd at Oz that has a cat. And she's got a green dress. And I've read so many urban legends about that scene that she's probably Kaiser Soze or some kind of like, not Kaiser Soze from The Usual Suspects. She's some kind of like Rollo Tomasi. I don't even know, man. She's like a gangster, this chick with the cat, and it scares Toto out of the balloon. And then Dorothy has to tap her heels to get home. And some people say that she could have done it the whole time because Glinda says she could have done it the whole time. But then that makes Glinda kind of mean because she wouldn't tell her that originally. That's not actually a flaw of the story because what Frank Baum was saying is that the only way the shoes would work, although she could have done it the whole time and said, she would have had to have known there's no place like home. Now that the witch is withholding information on her isn't necessarily the case. And this is a complex moment because we're saying the witch isn't necessarily needing Dorothy to kill the other witch, but she probably knows that witch is going to wreak vengeance on Oz because her sister, the other evil witch, was crushed by the house. And so the good witch is like, well, you have to go to the Wizard of Oz to see how to do this because you killed that one, and the evil one's going to wage war against the whole populace, probably because her other friend died from an accident with a house. Whether that's not what made her evil is probably seen in The Wizard of Oz, the new one, the Great, the Powerful Oz, with James Franco. And He does a great job, and Mila Kunis, she does a great job. They're amazing actors. The talent today, I mean, the talent today with actors is so beautiful because you think, I think anyway, that they don't get paid enough because it's the hardest job in the fucking world. Sorry for my language. To be an actor, it's actually, or a director, or any of these things, special effects maker, it's hard, animator. There's a lot of hard work that goes into this. I mean, I'm the lucky one that gets to be the critic and sits back and goes, pay them more or do more for them because they're so awesome making these movies. Like, if they want to save the whales, give them money to save the whales. And then, so I don't know if Glinda's like resolving a war or she's had, but her intentions must be good, but we never really find out what they are, that she doesn't tell Dorothy there's no place like home. And when Dorothy says there's no place like home and taps her shoes, she ends up waking up. Like she was, last we saw her in Oz, she was blowing, in Kansas, she was blowing around on a bed and crashing all over the room. When she wakes up at the end, and some of this may be discontinuous because it's like they don't always put all the frames of the film or the scenes of the film into the movie when they make the editing. They don't always just like put the scene in or they take it out, that they film everything out of order, kind of like exteriors to interiors or complicated shots to less complicated shots just for the scheduling. So you get the hard ones out of the way first, like Lloyd Kaufman would say. And then you get to back to Kansas and she's waking up and she sees everybody in her family, and then you realize her family at the beginning of the movie that she was talking to was all the characters of Oz, and then this could be like some symbolic metaphor of a like Freudian dreamlike cycle of the nuclear family and the family romance is seen through the eyes of a female, that's kind of feminist, that she's a female. Yeah, that she's dolled up as a kid. Well, I don't really care because, you know, when you take your kids to church, it necessarily isn't the most evil thing in the world. I know that church is the most evil thing in the world, but not taking your kids to church. No. But anyways, that she finds what she's looking for and gets to go home, I think, and I could be inferring this, that she's grateful that she didn't go home before she met her friends, Scarecrow, Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion. When she met her friends and she went to and defeated the witch and met the good witch and met the dwarves and, you know, met Oz and killed the witch, and all the things she did are experiences she's glad she has. And that's what cinema is experiences we're glad we have, because they're surrogate experiences we're glad we have, but the actors don't actually have those experiences in real life because they're shopping to film, that they go through an emotion that adjusts and justifies their surroundings is still strange because the film shot all in a sequence. And we never talk about how hard that is on the actors, because now the actors got to say, well, I'm on script page 38 and that says that we have a flashback, and now I'm trying to play a character in a film where that's the first scene we're shooting. So we don't have the backstory leading up to it. So that's how good actors are. They have to find the scene way later and then put it into their movie earlier, or find the scene early and put it into the movie later. Like, you could shoot the ending at the beginning and still put it on at the ending, and now the actors are already acting in it, so they have to act at the ending before they act the beginning. I know that's really confusing, but ask an actor how hard that is. They'll cuss at you and tell you to go home, you know, that you don't know what it's like. So that's why I think actors have it so hard, because continuity, when you're doing all these other jobs, you're sitting there going, well, we know we filmed this later. But the actor's just, as he's reading it, he's like, we're filming this thing like a crossword puzzle, or we're filming this thing like a jigsaw. Like, how do I go from scene 3 to scene 48 to scene 1 to scene 90 to scene 50 when I've got to act the way I need to act for continuity of the film? Let's hear it for actors, bro, especially American actors. Come on now. Do you know how hard that would be? I don't know how they do that, but I kind of do, but I just don't want to get into it, but yeah. So The Wizard of Oz, as we all know, is an American masterpiece, and we love the film, we revere the film, we worship the film, and I'd like to skip ahead to another film that we're not going to have enough time to talk about fully, but this might give us a glance into what happened when the classical Hollywood cinema kind of adjusted from the Paramount decree and the blacklist and all these horrible things that were happening with censorship, and that the right wing pretty much lost their edge in cinema with the whole Blacklist and House on Un-American Activities because they were jailing and prisonating people for telling everyone they were communists. And the irony is in Godfather 2, they have the House on Un-American Activities board talk to the gangsters about who's un-American, and that the gangsters proved to be all American by buying their way out of the court system is one of my favorite parts of the beginning of Godfather 2. Now, The Godfather is like The Wizard of Oz, that most of us have seen it, that not all of us have seen it, but we've all heard of it. We've all seen parodies, of course, of Wizard of Oz and The Godfather. That The Godfather and Wizard of Oz are the two best movies ever made? Probably. That they're close to it, that like Jean Vigo's Lawrence up there, and I don't want to get into these sort of semantics of foreign films versus Hollywood films, although the semantics of a foreign film just means that audiences in America may not as be familiar with it, because not everyone in America, like people in other countries, are necessarily interested in things that come from other countries. Now, that's not always true with Europe, since there's so many countries slammed in. They are kind of interested in what they do, but I don't really know enough about the political side of that to really get into it. But there is a political side, like in third world cinema, where the cinema is a populace, for the people, by the people. All the people, the populace that makes the film just turn the Cuban government sort of funds it. And again, we get this idea with The Godfather that the White House is not really affecting the way movies are made. And I think the politics are, but the White House itself doesn't direct film. They don't call the shots. And now we have Francis Ford Coppola directing. And by the way, Victor Fleming directed Wizard of Oz the same year he directed Gone with the Wind. That must be. But he had like 5 or 6 different directors help him with both. But it's still Victor Fleming. That he has directed Captain Blood, but he hasn't directed a lot of movies. And Captain Blood might even be Michael Curtiz. But Victor Fleming and his Mark Twain movie with color was an experience of color. But the fact that Victor Fleming is so mobile to do those 2 films doesn't really mean he did too many other films of significance. But The Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz are 2 of the most significant films ever. Would have been terrible to have to make both of them in the same year, and probably would have been the biggest case of burnout for any director, But Godfather is more important here now than Wizard of Oz, and you have to pick between the 2. And if I had to pick between the 2, I'd pick The Godfather, because Francis Ford Coppola, and I love Wizard of Oz, it used to be my favorite movie, but I don't really have a favorite movie anymore. I like Battleship Potemkin. Sorry for my pick on that one, because I know that's real controversial. I love Birth of a Nation. Sorry for my pick on that one, so it's totally controversial. So I can't really get into the films I love, because they're not that I'm loving them, that they're intentionally controversial, because they weren't really intentionally controversial, but I love them because of film studies and how you can delve into film studies on even like Fouillard's Les Vampires. Not just because he switches light switch and it changes color, but because you can learn a lot about the regions of cinema, the demarcations of cinema, the labyrinths of cinema, and the time and space and structure of cinema. So that by the time we get to The Godfather, we're in the modern era. Now remember, the modernism is to take down the apparatus and stare it back at itself. Like we're deconstructing all these pieces of a puzzle to equalize the hierarchies that can even be seen in The Wizard of Oz as to how we politically live our society. And these ways of seeing, or these practices of looking, like that book by Marita Sturken, is that all these images are looking at us through the images that we're looking at. And that just means that these pieces fall into this big context of what we see is what we are seeing, and then as film buffs, we're like, what we have to see is anything that comes in our interest, and the only type of films that we take out of our mind is illegal films. Now, I've seen some books on illegal films, and I do not want to talk about that. I do not watch illegal films, like, towing the line on illegalities like Lucifer Rising with Kenneth Anger, I'm okay with. With some really illegal films, I don't do that. Oh, we don't do that here. We'll let you do Kenneth Anger type stuff, but we're not going to let you do something like. And there's all these movies like Blair Witch Project that are like claiming to be illegal, like the cast and crew got eaten. But that would have been illegal if they would have released a film where the cast and crew got eaten, even if it wasn't in the film, because they would have had to investigate if a witch really did eat a bunch of kids. The cops and the FBI would be out investigating. It'd be like the end of Monty Python and the Holy Grail when the cops bust the Knights of the Round. It's like, wait a minute, these guys killed all the filmmakers. Now we're getting arrested just because we were, there when it happened. We were like witnesses for the prosecution. Anyway, The Godfather has nothing to do with that. The modern era is kind of this nostalgia that takes us all into mind, that takes the yearning to return home, but flips it around as this deconstructed, like home may be sacked, everything may be sacked. Existentialism comes into play in modernism big time, like John Paul Sartre's No Exits. And what that means is that existentialism, again, as we talked about Bresson, is loneliness, isolation, loss, and heartache or brokenheartedness. And that the ultimate appeal to modernism that's coming out is Johnny Got His Gun by Dalton and Trumbo, that it has this soldier with no arms and no legs. He's dying from the war. And as he dies, he sees the flashbacks of how terrible his life was. Now, this isn't just bad intentionally, but it's like a morosely concerned view about politics and war, is that like the wars have gotten so brutal and personal that everyone's seeing the war on TV now. In Vietnam, we're all going, wait a minute, this is worse than I thought. Turn this off, And then next thing you know, cinema is getting really complex in these modern eras. We see Wizard of Oz being really complex, but what I mean by really complex is now we're taking all the time to consider the films that we're kind of deconstructing into our own image, like the French New Wave would do. And then modernism kind of comes out with this red flag that's saying, well, everything's meaningless. There's no guarantees in life, and that the end is coming or the end is already past. And here we are with no exits, And then I know you can see kind of a no exit theme in Wizard of Oz. It isn't really like that because it's more like mission complete. There is an exit. She gets back to Kansas. That in Godfathers, there's no exits is kind of how the movie begins, because that he's the Godfather and became the Godfather is never really explained until Godfather 2. And even then, it never really shows his christening in the film necessarily in either one or the third one, where he becomes the Godfather. That it does show him kill the guy in Italy makes me wonder if that was Al Pacino, his son. And it is, because this film is so layered that it's complex to see it all. And that Robert Duvall's the lawyer of the family, that it deals with Italian Americans that have, like, in the second one, you'll see they come to Ellis Island like immigrants, like in those old silent films, the Italian. They get to Ellis Island, they start spreading out, and they come to, there's a rooftop sequence of Godfather 2 that's beautiful, where he has to assassinate someone. Young Marlon Brando, played by Robert De Niro. But Robert De Niro's not in the first one. We got James Caan, Al Pacino, Marlon Brando as the Godfather himself, Robert Duvall, and that they have, this is great, because on the back it shows a wedding scene. And since we're running out of time, we'll say the wedding scene is amazing because it gets the whole idea of like taking pictures, flashbulb pictures of a big crowd and kind of freeze framing it, but not freeze framing it, just having a freeze frame of a white picture that makes it look like the flash went off for everybody. I love in films when you take a picture and everybody sees the flash go off even if they're 10 miles away. Because everybody's watching the movie, so everybody gets the expectation that everyone saw this camera flash across the world, and that the guys come in and bust the camera, and Scorsese's real good at that, but they come in Raging Bull, but they come in and smash down the cameras because they're gangsters. This is the gangster film that takes up the tradition of the Hollywood classical cinema of Public Enemy, Little Caesar, and Scarface. Not the remake of Scarface, this Howard Hawks version. The remake's great too. That they never remade Public Enemy and Little Caesar, I don't know why. They might have, but I don't know if they did. And then they remade a good Scarface. I don't really care if they remake Public Enemy or Little Caesar, but it'd be kind of cool to make those. That they're making films right now, that I'm not even sure, even being a quasi-insider, that I'm really not that much following it anymore, because after the writer's strike, I had to do a lot of work for the Writers Guild. Not that I'm complaining, I'm just saying I don't know when these films are coming out, or if they are out, or if they're still releasing films in other places than my hometown, I don't know. Because my hometown's in Grand Junction. There are movies coming out here occasionally. Like, we went and saw Wonka, and we're like, well, it was cool, but where are all the other movies? And it wasn't really like that, because there were some other movies, but I'm not real sure about the Hollywood production, because it's been so long, and now people are quitting because they're not getting paid enough. And I agree, they're not getting paid enough. Are they capable of paying them more? I'm not sure. So we're not going to go around blaming the big business of Hollywood, because there's probably things about that situation I don't know, and I don't want to know. But that The Godfather has the best score by Coppola's dad, Carmine Coppola, and I'll tell you, and he also helped with the score of Apocalypse Now, but I'll tell you something interesting about Coppola, is that he was one of the Roger Corman grads that started with Dementia 13. We've talked about Dementia 13 being kind of this Roger Corman horror film where he had these kind of 13, the 13 I think comes from 13 Ghosts, and the dementia I think is one of those things that's coming out to be hysteria and what it used to be called as witchcraft in the early days of psychology when they couldn't explain psychology. That Carl Jung was into witchcraft we won't go into because that's a total secret and nobody's allowed to hear. You didn't hear it from me. This just in, you didn't hear it from me. That we will have more of a class on Godfather is true, and I think that we will delve more into it and we will get more into it, but I want to go into it deeper. That there's a scene in it that's really disturbing that goes back to my rumor of like someone will see a film phenomenologically and be really like taken aghast by it. It's like when my little sister watched The Godfather, she wasn't totally ruined like she was with the ending of Evil Dead 2 where everything went all crazy. She saw that part in The Godfather and she's like, ew. And I'm like, oh, I'm terrified this time. Like, oh, and there's a scene where I won't give a spoiler, but an animal gets killed and splayed all over a room, and you're just like, oh, I'm resigning. And everybody else is like, this is my favorite part. And I'm going, that's in the film? They actually put that in the film? And then I thought, well, it's a special effect. And it's a special effect, so it's probably used for the movie in some way. That it's the ultimate sign of the Godfather's power in all the movies. Yeah, that it's to get an actor a job in Hollywood is ironic because that just goes back to what we're talking about. But I wanted to talk more about The Godfather to get down to it because there's so much more. There's this scene at the end that's a montage, and Al Pacino kind of like, it reminds me of that scene in The Devil's Advocate where he puts his hand in holy water. But in The Godfather, there's this thing where, there's this thing where Al Pacino's christening his son, and meanwhile Marlon Brando's having the 5 leaders of the mafia taken down that we see earlier in a conference. That leaders of the mafia enter a conference is already controversial. That Coppola does have controversy, but it's so extremely well thought out that you can't really be affected by the controversy because you're like, it's such a good film. I don't care that gangsters rule the earth. You know? And so at the end, when all the 5 guys get shot, it keeps cutting back and forth, this cross-cutting, this parallel cutting, and we hear the preacher giving the sermon, but we also hear at the same time on the soundtrack bullets and shooting and bullets and knives and everything that's killing the 5 bosses. That there's always an aesthetic purpose for killing someone in a film is a Hitchcock idea that like you kill him with style, like in Strangers on a Train when he chokes the girl and the glasses fall off and fall to the ground. This is aestheticized violence, not glorified, because it still makes you hurt and wield and yield and say, oh, that's horrible. It kind of it's modern because it takes you out of the film, it pushes you out of the film, breaks the fourth wall, and makes you a character. And now you're a character. Not only are you a character, that's more postmodern. But the idea that the film is showing the process of itself in making is the whole idea of the film. So that the gangsters are getting rid of the guys who killed his son, that Al Pacino has a gun taped behind a toilet that he shoots Sterling Hayden with, that it shows you how to do a hit, and that part's pretty cool. I mean, it's not technically how to do a hit, but it pretty much shows you how to, if you're a gangster, how to, take down a police chief. I'm not saying that that's a good skill to have. I don't want that skill, do you? But it's a great movie. It's fucking fantastic. I love it. And I'm sorry I cuss, but really, I mean, it's absolutely amazing. And before I go, I just want to leave you with, I don't know if Harvard's not implementing a film school just because they can't get the reels of film, because most people watch it on digital and most silent films are shown digitally. I'm only going to require that you see the lectures, that you see the films, find the ones you have seen and maybe watch them again. Or try something new with a foreign film. I know, they're important. They're important. If you're studying film, you got to study foreign films. They're some of my favorite, but that doesn't make them some of yours. The silent era is even more difficult to get into because there's a whole element of sound missing. But then when we see the jazz singer, which is half silent, half sound, we're kind of going, maybe we should prefer the sound because that music's so melodious and it matches the images so well. So that sound is important, but that the silent era pretty much defines the stylistics of film is why I'd like you to see one. But the main thing is we do the final, we reconstruct the paper. We still have 3 other classes left. We'll talk about The Godfather some more. We have more to say about The Godfather, Godfather 2 and everything. There's not enough you could say about Wizard of Oz and Godfather, and I apologize. These lectures should have been 3 hours longer, right? But you're sitting through this going, what is he talking about? I already knew that, or that's weird. I never thought about that. Those are the kind of thing you encounter in film class and make notes of. So please, everyone, have a good day. We'll see you on the last 3. And this has been YouTube Masterclass. We'll talk to you next time. Bye.